Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into the life of one of the most restless, unpredictable, and uncompromising artists in modern music history, Neil Young. This is not just a story about a famous singer-songwriter. It is not only about hit albums, legendary bands, controversial choices, broken relationships, or public feuds. This is a story about a man who spent his entire life refusing to stay where people expected him to stay. Neil Young has been called many things: genius, rebel, survivor, difficult, visionary, stubborn, and impossible to control. And honestly, depending on which chapter of his life you are looking at, all of those descriptions may be true. Some people see Neil Young as a gentle folk icon, the kind of artist who sings with a fragile voice and makes people think about nature, memory, love, and loss. But if you look closer, you find something much more intense. Behind that fragile voice was a man who could abandon success the moment it became too comfortable. Behind the songs was someone who burned bridges, changed direction without warning, challenged his record labels, fought with friends, walked away from money, and followed his own instincts even when those instincts confused almost everyone around him. So do I agree with the idea that Neil Young left a trail of chaos behind him? In some ways, yes. He hurt people. He made choices that were painful for those close to him. He could be harsh, unpredictable, and emotionally difficult. But I also believe that reducing him to chaos would miss the deeper truth. Neil Young's life is not simply the story of a man who caused damage. It is the story of a man who survived damage, absorbed it, transformed it, and then kept moving, sometimes beautifully, sometimes recklessly, but almost always honestly. And that is what makes him fascinating. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves music history, and subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating deeper stories about the people behind the songs, the fame, and the legends. Now, let's begin. Neil Young's story begins in Canada, in the cold shadow of family conflict, illness, and instability. He was born on November 12, 1945, in Toronto. The world he entered was not peaceful. His parents were very different people, and those differences shaped the emotional weather of his childhood. His father, Scott Young, was a writer and sports journalist, charming, talented, and ambitious. His mother, Rassi, came from comfort but carried a strong, volatile personality. They were drawn to each other, but attraction is not the same as harmony. Their marriage became tense, and the home Neil grew up in was not always emotionally safe. This matters because when we talk about Neil Young's music, we often talk about sound, acoustic guitars, distorted electric feedback, harmonica, high thin vocals, country textures, and raw rock energy. But before sound becomes music, it begins as feeling. And Neil Young's earliest feelings were shaped by uncertainty. Children absorb more than adults realize. They may not understand every argument, every silence, or every mood in the house, but they feel the atmosphere. They know when love has become unstable. They know when parents are too consumed by their own conflict to fully see them. And for a sensitive child, that kind of emotional distance can become a lifelong hunger, a hunger to express what could not be safely spoken. When Neil was still young, his life was shaken by a terrifying illness. He contracted polio in the early 1950s, before vaccines had become widely available. That fact alone places his childhood in a very different world from the one many of us know today. Polio was not an abstract medical term. It was a nightmare for families. It could paralyze children, isolate them, and leave lasting physical consequences. Imagine being a child, suddenly feverish and weak, taken on a frightening journey to doctors, tests, and isolation. Imagine being separated from your family at an age when all you want is comfort. Imagine your body, which should feel like your safest home, becoming unpredictable. This would not be the last time Neil Young's body betrayed him. Later in life, he would deal with epilepsy, serious back pain, and even a life-threatening brain aneurysm. But polio was an early warning. Survival would be part of his identity. And survival changes people. Some survivors become cautious. They learn to avoid risk because they have already seen how fragile life can be. But others go in the opposite direction. They become restless. They think, if everything can be taken away anyway, why live timidly? Why obey rules that do not protect you? Why stay in the middle of the road when the ditch may be more honest? Neil Young became the second kind of survivor. Music entered his life as a refuge. At 13, he received a cheap plastic ukulele. To an outsider, that may sound like a small gift. But sometimes a small object opens a large door. A child who feels unseen can pick up an instrument and discover a private language. A few chords become a shelter. A melody becomes a way to organize pain. When his parents' marriage finally collapsed, music became even more important. Neil moved with his mother to Winnipeg, and his focus intensified. He was not merely interested in music. He became consumed by it. This is a pattern we see in many great artists. Their craft is not a hobby. It is a survival mechanism. They do not create because life is easy. They create because life is overwhelming. Music becomes the place where confusion can turn into shape. By the time Neil was a young man, he was already performing in coffee houses across Canada. These were not glamorous stages. They were small rooms, filled with smoke, restless listeners, and young artists trying to find their voices. But for Neil, every room was training. Every song was a step toward becoming himself. Then came Kent State. In May 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters at Kent State University, killing 4 students and wounding others. The event shocked the United States. For Neil Young, it triggered an immediate creative response. He wrote "Ohio," one of the most famous protest songs of its era. This moment matters because it shows the speed of his moral reaction. Some artists wait until history cools down before they speak. Neil Young often did the opposite. He responded while the wound was still open. There is power in that. There is also risk. Protest music can become dated if it is too tied to a moment, but when it captures the emotional truth of that moment, it can outlive the headlines. Ohio did not simply describe an event. It expressed outrage, grief, and disbelief. It turned public trauma into collective memory. This became part of Young's identity, the artist as witness. Not always consistent, not always politically predictable, but often unwilling to remain silent when something disturbed him. Around this time, Young's personal life took another major turn. After seeing the film Diary of a Mad Housewife, he became fascinated by actress Carrie Snodgrass. He sent a note asking her to call him. Their first meeting was unconventional. Young was suffering from severe back pain, and Snodgrass entered his life not through glamour, but through vulnerability. That detail is important. Love stories in celebrity culture are often told through beauty, parties, and fame. But many real relationships begin through need. Someone sees us when we are weak. Someone does not run when the image breaks. Someone enters not when we are most impressive, but when we are most human. Snodgrass once suggested that she fell in love with his pain. That line is revealing. Some people are drawn to wounded artists because the wound feels like depth. But loving someone's pain can be dangerous. Pain may be poetic from a distance, but living beside it can be exhausting. Young's back injury forced him to slow down musically. Unable to perform with the same physical intensity, he moved toward a more acoustic, country-influenced sound. Out of that fragile period came Harvest in 1972. Harvest became his most commercially successful album. It put him at the center of mainstream popularity. For many artists, that would have been the dream: huge sales, wide recognition, a sound that reached millions. But for Neil Young, success quickly became uncomfortable. He famously described the middle of the road as boring and chose what he called the ditch. Suddenly, robotic vocals become less like gimmick and more like metaphor. Still, Geffen Records was not impressed. The label famously sued Young, accusing him of making music that did not represent himself. This lawsuit is almost absurd when you think about it. How can anyone tell Neil Young he is not being Neil Young? His entire identity was built on refusing to be one thing. But from a corporate perspective, the frustration is understandable. Labels invest in predictability. They want a marketable brand. They want the audience to know what they are buying. Neil Young gave them the opposite. He moved from electronic experimentation to rockabilly to country and beyond. He seemed almost determined to make each new turn harder to package. Most artists soften with age. Not all, but many. The fire becomes brand management. The rebellion becomes nostalgia. The danger becomes merchandise. But Neil Young remained willing to make inconvenient choices. This does not mean every stance he took was beyond debate. It means he kept acting as though music was connected to conscience. For him, art was not just content. It was not merely a catalog to be monetized. It was part of a moral life. That is one reason his career still matters. Neil Young's story is not a straight line from poverty to success, or from pain to triumph. It is a crooked road through illness, ambition, reinvention, love, failure, protest, fatherhood, grief, controversy, and survival. And if there is one word that defines him, it may be refusal. He refused to be only a folk singer. He refused to be only a rock guitarist. He refused to give record labels the safe version of himself. He refused to make the same successful album again just because people wanted it. He refused to stay quiet when he felt something was wrong. He refused to let illness completely define him. He refused the middle of the road. But refusal is not always noble. Sometimes it is necessary. Sometimes it is selfish. Sometimes it liberates the artist and wounds the people nearby. That is why Neil Young's life is so powerful as a story. It does not give us easy answers. He teaches us that artistic freedom is beautiful, but expensive. He teaches us that reinvention can keep a person alive, but it can also leave others struggling to understand where they stand. He teaches us that success can become a cage if you mistake applause for truth. He teaches us that survival is not gentle. Sometimes survival looks like distortion, broken relationships, angry letters, strange albums, and decisions that confuse everyone except the person making them. And he teaches us that the people who change culture are often not comfortable people. In the middle of all this, there is a real-life lesson that applies far beyond music. Imagine a young person in a small town who has one talent that makes them feel alive. Maybe it is music. Maybe it is design. Maybe it is writing, engineering, teaching, building, or speaking. Everyone around them says, be practical. Choose the safe road. Do not risk too much. And sometimes that advice is loving. But sometimes it is fear disguised as wisdom. Neil Young's life does not tell us to be reckless. It tells us something more difficult: do not betray your deepest voice just because the world rewards predictability. But there is another lesson too. Imagine a spouse, a child, a bandmate, or a friend living beside someone who is always chasing the next horizon. To the world, that person looks brave. At home, they may feel impossible. Their freedom may become someone else's loneliness. Their reinvention may become someone else's instability. That is the tension we must hold. The artist's truth matters. The people affected by the artist's choices matter too. A truly mature understanding of Neil Young requires both admiration and honesty. We can admire his courage without ignoring the damage. We can criticize his choices without dismissing his brilliance. We can recognize that he was not a saint, not a villain, but a deeply driven human being who turned unrest into music. And what music it was! Across decades, Neil Young created songs that felt intimate and enormous at the same time. He could sound like a lonely man singing in a room, and he could sound like a storm tearing through an amplifier. He wrote about love, age, politics, memory, violence, innocence, decay, and the strange burden of being alive. His voice was never technically perfect in the traditional sense. But perfection was never the point. His voice carried fracture. It sounded vulnerable, almost breakable, and that breakability became part of its power. In a world full of polished performers, Neil Young sounded human. That may be why his work has lasted. Polish can impress people. Humanity reaches them. When he sang softly, you could hear the ache. When he played loudly, you could hear the refusal. When he changed direction, you could hear the restlessness. Even his failures sounded like they belonged to him. There is dignity in that. Many artists produce work designed to please everyone and end up sounding like no one. Neil Young sometimes pleased almost no one in the moment, but he always sounded like himself. That is rare. As we look back over his life, the dramatic episodes stand out: the childhood illness, the broken family, the wild early bands, the move to Los Angeles, Buffalo Springfield, the strange Manson encounter, Crazy Horse, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the protest anthem, Harvest, The Ditch, Danny Whitten's death, the experimental albums, the lawsuit, the bridge school, the grunge connection, the aneurysm, the divorce, the relationship with Daryl Hannah, the fights with technology platforms. But beneath all of those events is a deeper emotional pattern. Neil Young kept facing moments where life asked him to become smaller, safer, or easier to understand. And he kept saying no. That no shaped his greatness. It also shaped his loneliness. Because when you refuse the road everyone else understands, you cannot expect everyone to follow you. Some fans will leave. Some friends will resent you. Some partners will be hurt. Some critics will call you lost. Some companies will call you difficult. Some people will decide you are not worth the trouble, but the people who remain may understand something deeper, that the point was never comfort. The point was truth. And truth, in Neil Young's world, was rarely smooth. It had feedback. It had scars. It had wrong turns. It had contradictions. It had beauty that sometimes arrived covered in dust. That is why his story can inspire us without becoming simplistic. We do not have to live exactly like Neil Young to learn from him. Most of us should not. But we can learn from the courage to keep changing. We can learn from the refusal to become a product. We can learn from the willingness to speak when silence would be more profitable. We can learn from the way pain can become art, and art can become service, as it did with the Bridge School. We can also learn from the costs. If you are building a career, do not confuse movement with escape. If you are chasing a dream, remember the people who are carrying part of its weight. If you are standing on principle, make sure it is conscience speaking, not ego wearing a noble mask. If you are reinventing yourself, do not use reinvention as an excuse to abandon compassion. And if you are afraid to leave the middle of the road, ask yourself this: are you staying there because it is right for you, or because other people understand you better when you are there? Neil Young's life does not offer a clean answer. It offers a challenge. Live honestly, but not carelessly. Create bravely, but not blindly. Love deeply, but do not pretend love is painless. Survive, but do not let survival make you cold. And when the world tries to reduce you to one version of yourself, remember that a life is allowed to have many sounds. It can be acoustic. It can be electric. It can be tender. It can be furious. It can be beautiful. It can be difficult. It can be all of those things and still be true. Neil Young is not remembered because he made everyone comfortable. He is remembered because he kept moving toward the sound he heard inside himself, even when that sound led him away from applause, away from money, away from expectation, and sometimes away from people who loved him. That is the blessing and the burden of his life. In the end, Neil Young's story is not about a perfect man. It is about an unquiet man. A man who survived childhood illness, family fracture, artistic battles, physical danger, personal loss, and public criticism. A man who made mistakes, hurt people, helped people, confused people, inspired people, and refused to become easy. And maybe that is why his music still matters. Because life is not easy either. Life does not stay in one genre. It changes tempo without asking. It goes acoustic when we expected thunder. It turns electric when we wanted peace. It breaks our bodies, tests our loyalties, steals people we love, and then somehow asks us to keep singing. Neil Young kept singing. Not always sweetly. Not always wisely. Not always gently. But honestly enough that generations could hear something real inside the noise. And that is where we leave him, not in the middle of the road, not safely packaged, not fully explained, but somewhere out in the ditch he chose for himself, still searching, still resisting, still reminding us that the most meaningful lives are not always the neatest ones. So if this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think differently about Neil Young, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories from music history. And remember this, the world will always reward people who are easy to understand, but history remembers the ones brave enough to become impossible to ignore. Thank you for watching.